The day Eva Bristol arrived in Dusthaven, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she arrived with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer tucked inside her boot, and a vow so deeply carved into her bones that she wore it like armor over her skin. She would never rely on a man again. Not for money, not for shelter, not for safety, and certainly not for love. She had learned that lesson the hard way, the way most women in the American West learned things, through the particular cruelty of betrayal dressed up in charm. Dusthaven was the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped onto the red Texas soil by accident, and then decided to stay out of stubbornness. It had one main street lined with sun-bleached storefronts, a saloon called the Copper Spur that smelled of sawdust and cheap whiskey even from 50 feet away, a general store, a livery stable, a tiny church that leaned slightly to the left as if tired of standing upright, and a hotel called the Prairie Rose that had 4 rooms and perpetually damp towels. The population was somewhere around 300 souls, give or take, who had ridden out that week, and whether you counted the Chinese workers who had settled just east of town after the railroad construction had wound down. Eva had come here because the advertisement in the San Antonio Express had been specific. Wanted, a woman of competent character and steady hand to manage the bookkeeping and daily operations of the Dusthaven Mercantile, property of one Mr. Arthur Finch, recently widowed. Room and board provided, salary negotiable. She had answered the advertisement because Dusthaven was exactly 200 miles from the man she was leaving behind, her former employer and, God help her, the man she had very nearly trusted, a cotton merchant named Gerald Rowe who had embezzled from his own business, blamed it on her, and then had the tremendous nerve to suggest she might avoid legal trouble if she simply married him and kept her mouth shut. Eva had kept her mouth shut long enough to gather her evidence, present it to the county clerk in San Antonio, and then board the first stage heading northwest while Gerald's attorneys were still trying to figure out what had happened. She was 26 years old, sharp-eyed, capable, and finished with men who mistook her intelligence for something they could use. Arthur Finch turned out to be a kind, round-faced man of 52 with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a tendency to hum tunelessly when he was thinking. He met her at the stage stop with a handshake rather than a tip of his hat and a suspicious squint at her carpetbag. "You travel light," he observed. "I travel practical," she said. He liked that. She could see it in the small smile that crossed his weathered face. "Can you manage inventory ledgers? My wife kept them in a system I cannot make heads or tails of." "I can manage any system, Mr. Finch, and build a better one if needed." He hired her on the spot. The room she was given above the mercantile was small but clean, with a window that faced east so the morning sun woke her gently rather than rudely. She spent her first 3 days in Dusthaven organizing Arthur Finch's records, which were less a system and more a prayer. She found receipts tucked inside coffee tins, invoices used as bookmarks in a Bible, and an entire month of accounts written on the back of what appeared to be a recipe for apple cake. She built the man a proper ledger system in a week. She organized the store's shelves by practical logic rather than Arthur's original method of putting things wherever there was space. She negotiated directly with the supply wagon driver, a sunburned man named Pete who had apparently been overcharging Arthur Finch for years under the assumption that a grief-dazed widower would not notice. Eva noticed. Pete left their first negotiation looking like a man who had sat down to play cards against a wall and lost. She was happy. Or she was something close enough to it that the distinction did not matter. She was independent. She was useful. She owed nothing to anyone she had not chosen to owe it to. That was the state of things when Benjamin Lockhart rode into Dusthaven on a Thursday afternoon in early April, with a bay horse named Cinder, a hat that had survived what appeared to be several significant adventures, and a reputation that preceded him the way a thunderstorm preceded itself. You could feel it in the air before it arrived. Eva did not see him ride in. She was in the back of the mercantile taking stock of the dry goods when she heard Arthur Finch's voice through the thin wall, warm with genuine pleasure. "Benjamin Lockhart, I'll be damned. Excuse my language. It's been, what, 2 years?" "Close enough," said a voice that was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to fill a room. "How are you holding up, Arthur?" "Better now that I have help. Come through to the back, I want you to meet my new bookkeeper." Eva straightened. She smoothed her apron out of habit, felt the familiar small irritation at the gesture, why should she smooth anything for anyone, and planted her feet. The man who followed Arthur Finch through the back doorway was tall but not ostentatiously so. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled at the edges where it had grown past his collar, and a face that had been tanned by years under open sky to a warm bronze. He had dark eyes, brown with something almost amber in the center when the light caught them, and there was a kind of steadiness in the set of his jaw that Eva had not often seen in men. Most men wore their expressions like masks they were not quite comfortable in. This man's face simply was what it was. He saw her and he nodded. Not a tipping of the hat with a wink, not the slow look up and down that Eva had grown accustomed to navigating, just a direct, respectful nod. "Benjamin Lockhart," he said, offering his hand. She shook it. "Eva Bristol. Miss Bristol has entirely reformed my business," Arthur said happily. "She found 3 years of Pete Morrison's overcharging in a single afternoon." Something shifted in Benjamin Lockhart's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that he had decided to consider further. "You caught Pete Morrison overcharging." "It wasn't difficult," Eva said. "He was not particularly creative about it. Most people never catch him at all. Most people don't look." There was a beat of silence. Arthur Finch beamed at them both. Benjamin Lockhart tilted his head a fraction, as if something had caught his attention that he had not been expecting, and then he said, "Well," which was not particularly illuminating but seemed to mean something. He had come to collect a supply order for the Lockhart Ranch, which sat approximately 12 miles northeast of Dusthaven on land his father had homesteaded in 1861. He managed it himself now, his father having passed the previous winter. He ran 400 head of cattle, employed 6 ranch hands year-round, and he drove his own cattle to the railhead at Abilene every autumn rather than selling to the stock buyers, who came through the territory offering prices that were, in Eva's estimation when she later heard about this practice, exactly as fair as any man found convenient for himself and no fairer. She watched him load his wagon without asking anyone for help, not because she was watching him particularly, she told herself, but because the loading dock was visible from the inventory room window and she happened to be near it. He was methodical. He stacked things properly, balanced the weight, and when one of the sacks of flour slipped from the back of the wagon, he caught it before it hit the ground with the reflexive ease of someone who had been doing physical work long enough that his body thought for itself. Eva turned back to her ledger. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She had not thought about whether she had expected him to return. She simply noted his arrivals the way she noted everything, as information that might prove relevant. The second Thursday he brought a list of supplies and also, apparently, an opinion about the mercantile's coffee, which Arthur had recently switched to a cheaper blend from the original supplier. "It tastes like a memory of coffee," he told Arthur, who looked faintly wounded. "The price was better," Arthur said. "The cost will be in customers," Benjamin said, and then he looked at Eva as if expecting either confirmation or contradiction. "He's correct," she said, without looking up from the accounts. "Coffee is not a luxury item for most of your clientele, Mr. Finch. It is a daily necessity. Downgrade it and they'll notice. I can write to the original supplier and negotiate the original terms back." Arthur looked between the two of them. "I bought 60 pounds of the new blend." "I'll purchase it," Benjamin said. "My hands don't complain about coffee. They're grateful for any coffee." That was how the arrangement began. It was not a personal arrangement. It was a practical one. Eva wrote to the original coffee supplier that very afternoon, And within 2 weeks Arthur Finch's Mercantile had its original coffee back at the original price, and Benjamin Lockhart had 60 pounds of inferior blend that he was apparently feeding to 6 ranch hands who did not know the difference. The third Thursday he came, Eva was dealing with a different kind of problem. The Mercantile's front door had a bell above it, and the bell had a tendency to fall if the door was opened too sharply. It had fallen twice already that week, and the second time it had narrowly missed old Mrs. Calloway, who was 73 and not in the ideal condition for having bells dropped near her. Eva was standing on a chair attempting to fix the bracket with a screwdriver that was slightly the wrong size when the door opened, and the bell fell again, directly into the hands of Benjamin Lockhart, who caught it without apparent effort or surprise. He looked at the bell in his hand. He looked at Eva on the chair. He looked at the screwdriver. "I can fix that," he said. "I was fixing it," she said, "with a screwdriver that's too small for those screws. I'm aware of the limitation." He set the bell on the counter. "I have a kit in my wagon, correct size, won't take but 5 minutes." She looked at him. She was on a chair and he was standing below her, which should have given her the advantage of height. But the expression on his face was so entirely devoid of any suggestion that he was doing her a favor, or expected her gratitude, or thought she could not manage without him, that she found she had no argument prepared for it. He was offering the same thing he might offer anyone with a bell and a wrong-sized screwdriver. He was offering the right tool. 5 minutes, she said. It took 4. He fixed the bracket, rehung the bell, tested it twice, and put his kit back in his wagon. When he came back inside to collect his supply order, he said nothing about it, made no comment about the quality of her almost fix or what he had done better, just paid Arthur for the goods, nodded to Eva, and loaded the wagon. She sat at her desk, looking at the bell for a long moment after he was gone. "He's a good man," Arthur said from behind her, because Arthur had apparently decided his role in this situation was to be as transparent as glass. "He fixed a bell," Eva said. "He fixed your father's roof last year when you were struggling," Arthur told her, then caught himself. "Forgive me. I meant he helped the Reardon family last summer when their barn burned, and the Nguyen family east of town when they had trouble with some men who decided their presence in Dusthaven was unwelcome." Eva turned at that. "What kind of trouble?" Arthur's face became something more serious. "There are men in this territory who believe the Chinese workers who stayed after the railroad don't belong here. Ugly business. Benjamin rode out there twice, talked to the sheriff, and made it clear enough that the Nguyen family had his backing that the trouble stopped." Eva thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about a man who used whatever standing he had not for himself but for other people, and she was careful to keep that thought in a properly labeled box and not let it do anything it had not been invited to do. Spring deepened into May. Dusthaven's dusty Main Street softened slightly with the occasional rain that came through, and the cottonwood trees along the creek at the edge of town leafed out in that tender green that made the whole landscape look newly painted. Eva had settled into the rhythms of the town in a way that surprised her with its comfort. She knew people's names. She knew that old Mrs. Calloway took licorice candy on credit every week and always paid it back at the end of the month. She knew that the blacksmith, a man named Tors, made the best tamales in the county and brought them to the Mercantile on Saturday mornings to sell from a basket. She knew that the Nguyen family, who grew vegetables on their small plot east of town, brought lettuces and spring onions to trade, and she had started stocking them beside the dry goods because fresh produce moved faster than anything else on the shelves. She had also learned, through the particular osmosis of small-town information, a great deal about Benjamin Lockhart that she had not asked for. She learned that he had gone to fight in the war between the states on the Union side, despite being from Texas, which had cost him relationships and made him something of an outsider in certain circles even now, 13 years later. She learned that he had come home at 22 to a ranch that was still standing because his father had managed to keep it going, and that he had spent the years since building it into something solid. She learned that he had been engaged once briefly to a woman named Caroline Marsh who had decided, after one full summer on the ranch, that she was not suited to frontier life and had gone back to her family in Missouri. She learned this from the barber's wife, who delivered it as gossip, but Eva filed it simply as information. She learned that he read. This she learned from Arthur, who told her Benjamin had standing orders for books from the catalog supplier history, mostly, and some natural philosophy, and the occasional novel that he apparently did not advertise. She found herself wondering about the novels. The first time they had a real conversation was at Tor's Tamale Saturday, when the mercantile was busy and Benjamin had come in for supplies, and found himself waiting while Eva assisted 4 different customers simultaneously with the particular focused competence she brought to everything. When the rush cleared, he was still there, eating a tamale from the basket and looking perfectly content to wait. "You are very efficient," he said. "It comes from not having the option not to be," she said, which was more honest than she had intended. He looked at her steadily. "Where are you from originally, if you don't mind the question?" "Nashville, then San Antonio for 6 years." "Long way from Nashville." "It was a gradual departure," she said, which made him smile, and the smile changed his face considerably, not into something softer exactly, but into something that showed how much warmth was already there waiting. She asked him something before she had thought it through enough to stop herself. "Arthur says you've been ordering novels from the catalog." He did not look surprised or embarrassed. "He told you that. He mentioned it in passing." "I order them because they're better than they're given credit for," he said, with the settled confidence of someone who had arrived at this opinion through experience rather than theory. "What do you read?" "Everything," she said. "Whatever I can find. Out here that's mostly whatever the catalog carries and whatever comes through on the stage." He nodded. "I have a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that I finished last month if you'd like to borrow it." She almost said no. She felt the word forming the automatic refusal that was partly protection and partly principle, but it was just a book. It was not dependence to borrow a book. "I would," she said. He brought it the following Thursday, wrapped in a piece of canvas to protect it from dust. He did not make an event of it, simply handed it to her with the same matter-of-fact manner he brought to everything, and asked if she had a preference for what he should request next from the catalog. She thought about it for a moment. "Henry James," she said, "if they carry it. I'll see." She read Middlemarch over 2 evenings, sitting by her window with a lamp burning, and she was struck by Dorothea Brooke with a force that felt uncomfortably personal. A woman of great capability and aspiration, trying to navigate a world that offered her insufficient space. She thought about what it might be like to meet a man who offered you the right amount of space. Then she thought about something else. The following Thursday she gave the book back. "Well," he asked, "it made me angry in several places," she said, "and I mean that as a compliment." He considered this. "The best books do that. Casaubon is a specific kind of horror," she said. "A man who mistakes the collecting of knowledge for wisdom," Benjamin said without hesitation, as if he had thought about it too, "and mistakes a woman's devotion for a research assistant." Eva looked at him. He looked at her. There was something in the air between them that she recognized and did not want to name, so she turned back to the ledger. June came in warm and dry, with a heat that sat on the land like a hand pressing down. The cattle on the surrounding ranches grew sluggish in the afternoons, and the creek east of town dropped to half its usual volume. Eva learned to open the mercantile's back door in the early morning to capture any cool air before the sun climbed fully and put an end to the idea of it. The trouble began on a Tuesday in mid-June, and it began, as trouble often did in the frontier towns of 1878 Texas, with men who drank too much and had too much confidence in their own grievances. 3 men came through Dusthaven that week, drifters, by the look of them, though they had money enough for a few nights at the Prairie Rose. They were the kind of men who existed in the border between not quite outlaw and not quite honest, and they made their presence felt in the way that kind always did, loudly, and in increments that each seemed small until you looked at them all together. The first thing they did was pick a fight in the Copper Spur Saloon with two of the Nguyen family's older sons, which the sheriff, a tired man named Hadley who had been doing this job for 15 years and was thinking seriously about retirement, broke up with minimal enthusiasm. The second thing they did was come into the mercantile. Eva was at the counter. Arthur was in the storeroom. The three men spread themselves across the space in the way that men who want to take up room do, one at the counter, one wandering the shelves, one near the door. The one at the counter had a smile that had been put on over something colder. "What do you have in the way of ammunition, sweetheart?" "We have rifle cartridges, revolver rounds in several calibers, and shotgun shells," Eva said, in the same tone she used for discussing flour prices. "What caliber do you need?" he told her, and she got it from the case behind the counter, set it down, named the price. He paid it. She made change. The transaction was, externally, completely normal, and throughout it she was aware of the weight of the derringer in her boot and the equally important weight of not showing that she was aware. The man at the shelves knocked a jar of preserved peaches to the floor, apparently accidentally, watched it shatter, and said nothing about it. Eva looked at him. "That's 40 cents, she said. He blinked. "What? The peaches? 40 cents? He laughed, glanced at his friends, looked back at her. "Little bossy for a store girl." 40 cents, Eva said again, in the exact same tone. There was a long moment during which several things could have happened. What happened was the man at the counter put 40 cents on the counter, something that seemed to surprise even himself, and said, "Come on," to the other two, and they left. Eva did not move for several seconds after the door closed. Then she bent down, picked up the largest pieces of glass, and swept up the rest, and she was steady throughout, but her hands were slightly cold, and she noted that and filed it. Arthur came out of the storeroom. He had heard all of it through the wall, and his face was troubled. "I'll speak to Sheriff Hadley." "Do," Eva said, "and lock the storeroom door when you're in there from now on." She did not think about Benjamin Lockhart. She did not think about him at all. He came that Thursday as usual, and she told him about it in the same tone she used to tell him about the coffee situation or the bell bracket, because it was information and he was someone whose opinion she had begun to find worth having, which she acknowledged privately and cautiously. His expression did not change dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Did Hadley do anything? He spoke to them. Hadley speaking to someone is roughly as effective as a suggestion left in the weather, he said. He thought for a moment. They're still at the Prairie Rose, as of this morning. He nodded slowly and then changed the subject in a way that was so deliberate she recognized he was doing it, not running away from the topic but choosing not to press her further, letting her own the situation. "Henry James hasn't come in yet, but I found a copy of something you might like in the catalog. Mary Wollstonecraft." She stared at him. "The Vindication," he said, confirming what she had already thought. "It was my mother's. I found it in a box I hadn't gotten through yet after she passed. I thought you might want to read it before I did. Before you." She said, and she meant it as a question about whether he intended to read it himself, because she could not quite picture a cattle rancher in 1878 Texas voluntarily reading a vindication of the rights of woman. "I've been curious about it since I found it," he said simply. "My mother underlined things." Eva did not know what to do with that, so she held out her hand for the book. She read her mother's underlines late that night by lamplight, and she thought about a woman who had raised a son on a frontier ranch and had kept, through all of it, a book with underlines in it, and she thought about what that said about the son she had raised. The drifters left Dusthaven that Friday, and Eva noted their departure with relief and did not allow herself to note the other thing she was feeling, which was that she had not been entirely sure she was not going to need help and had been clenching her jaw about it for 3 days. She was fine. She had handled it. She had not needed anyone. The summer pressed on in waves of heat and occasional spectacular thunderstorms that rolled in from the west and turned the air electric before the rain arrived. Eva had been in Dusthaven for 4 months, and she had become, without quite deciding to become it, a person who belonged there. She had opinions about town decisions that she was not shy about expressing. She had helped Mrs. Calloway draft a letter to her daughter in Georgia. She had taught the Torr's children basic arithmetic in the evenings twice a week because their father asked, and because she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she liked teaching. She and Benjamin Lockhart had not moved, officially, beyond Thursday supply collection and book exchange. Unofficially, they had built something she did not have a precise word for, a structure made of conversation and steady presence, and the particular ease of being with someone who did not require management. He was always himself. He never performed. It was Arthur Finch who finally said what he apparently thought needed to be said, on a Wednesday afternoon when Benjamin was not there and Eva was working on the quarterly accounts. "You know he comes in on Thursdays," Arthur said. "I know that, Arthur. I handle the supply orders. He started coming on Thursdays after you started. He used to come on Tuesdays." Eva looked up from the ledger. Arthur looked back at her with the particular serene confidence of a man who has decided he is old enough to say what he observes. "He changed his supply days because of the inventory schedule I implemented," Eva said. "Thursdays make more logistical sense. He told me the other day he hasn't read this many books since before the war," Arthur said, and returned to the storeroom, leaving Eva alone with the quarterly accounts and a thought she refused to look directly at. July came in hotter than June, and with it came a development that changed the shape of Eva's life in Dusthaven in ways she could not have predicted. Arthur Finch had a heart episode. It was not fatal, but it was serious enough that Dr. Alcott, who ran a practice out of a converted room in the hotel, confined Arthur to rest for 6 weeks and forbade him from any significant physical or administrative effort. Arthur, lying in his room above the mercantile with a face the color of old candle wax, looked at Eva with the expression of a man who had just realized the architecture of his world had shifted. "The mercantile," he said. "I'll manage it," she said. "The supply wagon comes on the 12th, I know. I handle the orders. The rent on the building is paid to Davies at the bank. I know, Arthur. I have had access to all your accounts for 4 months. I know everything." He subsided. Then he said, more quietly, "There's a quarterly loan payment due at the end of July, to the Merchants Bank out of Fort Worth. It's in the third ledger back section." She found the third ledger that evening. The loan was for a larger amount than she had been aware of. Arthur had borrowed against the business 5 years ago to fund a significant expansion, and the payments had been ongoing, and the books balanced only if everything ran exactly right and there were no major disruptions to supply or trade. She sat with this for a long time, doing calculations that were not comforting. The mercantile was viable, but it was not robustly so. One bad quarter and the numbers would not work. She was going to make sure it was not a bad quarter. What she did not expect was Benjamin Lockhart arriving at the mercantile the following day, a Friday, not a Thursday, with a flat look on his face and a directness that was unusual even for him. "Arthur sent word," he said. "He shouldn't have. I have it managed." "I know you do." He leaned against the counter. "I'm not here to offer help with the business. I know you don't need it. I'm here to tell you that if you need to talk to the Merchants Bank in Fort Worth before the end of the month, my name carries some weight there, and I'll write a letter of reference if it's useful." Eva looked at him for a long moment. The thing about what he had said was the order in which he had said it. "I know you don't need it. Not I'm here because you need help, but I know you don't, and here is a specific thing anyway. You wouldn't even be managing something for me," she said slowly, thinking it through out loud. "You'd be acting as a reference." "Exactly. You'd still be doing everything yourself, which you clearly will. I don't know that I'll need it." "Probably you won't," he said agreeably. "The letter will be with Arthur if you want it." He left, and she stood at the counter with the strange sensation of a door she had been bracing against not pushing the way she had expected. She spent the next week working harder than she had since arriving in Dusthaven. She managed the supply wagon, the accounts, the store floor, the customer relationships, and Arthur's correspondence. She came down from her room at 5 in the morning and went back up at 9 at night, and she did not complain about it because it was not a complaint situation. It was a management situation, and she was good at it. What she also did, because she was honest with herself about what she needed even when she did not need help, was accept Benjamin Lockhart's offer of conversation when he came on Thursday with his supply order, and stayed, after the order was loaded, to sit with her on the mercantile's back steps in the cool of late afternoon. They talked. They talked about books and about the ranch, and about the state of the cattle industry, and about what Eva thought Dusthaven could be if certain things were different, and about the history of the land they were sitting on, which was Comanche territory not 20 years ago, and they were quiet about that for a moment, the weight of what had been done to make room for towns like this one settling over both of them, with the particular gravity of things you could acknowledge but not undo. "My father homesteaded this land in '61, Benjamin said. He knew what he was coming into. He made choices I couldn't make for him. And you've thought about it." "I've thought about it most of my adult life," he said. He was looking out across the flat scrubland behind the store, and his face held the complicated expression of a man who has not arrived at a simple answer because there is no simple answer. "There are families east of here that the government pushed off land they had held for generations. I don't know how to make that right. I know it can't be made right by guilt alone. Or by pretending it didn't happen," Eva said. "Or that," he agreed. She looked at him sitting there, this man who thought about uncomfortable things and did not perform his thinking, who wrote letters of reference instead of riding in on white horses, who changed his supply days for logistical reasons and brought books without making them into gestures, and she felt something she had been carefully not feeling for 4 months rise up in her chest with a force that alarmed her. She stood up. "I have to get back to the accounts," she said, more abruptly than she intended. He looked up at her. He saw something, she was sure of it. He always saw more than he said, this man, and it had never bothered her until now. "Of course," he said, and that was all. She was furious with herself for the next 2 days in the way you are furious when you are losing an argument with yourself that you had been confident you were winning. She was not going to fall in love with Benjamin Lockhart. She was not going to rely on anyone, and love was the most complete form of reliance there was. You handed yourself over in love. You became contingent on another person's continued presence and goodwill, and she knew what men's goodwill looked like when it was strategically applied, and what it looked like when it quietly withdrew. She thought about Gerald Rowe, who had been charming for 3 years and catastrophically dishonest in the 4th. She thought about her father, who had been the center of a household that fell apart entirely when he left it, who had raised her mother to run nothing and know nothing and depend on everything, so that when he died there was nothing left but the dependence. She had promised herself. In San Antonio, on the day she presented her evidence to the county clerk and walked out of Gerald Rowe's orbit forever, she had made herself a promise so absolute it felt constitutional. She was not going to break it for a man who fixed bells and brought books and sat on back steps and thought about history. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in early August, everything shifted again. Eva had been managing the mercantile alone for 3 weeks. Arthur was recovering well. Dr. Alcott had cleared him for light activity, and he was beginning to come downstairs in the mornings to sit in his chair and receive customers, though Eva still handled all the actual work. The quarterly loan payment had been managed without drama, the books were in good shape, and Eva had negotiated a new supplier for several dry goods that would save Arthur approximately 12% per year. She was in the middle of taking stock of the dry goods room when she heard raised voices in the front of the store. She came out to find a man she did not know, tall, broad, with a marshal's badge on his chest that was doing a lot of work to make up for the rest of his demeanor, standing at the counter talking to Arthur, who was in his chair and looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm telling you she's wanted," the man said, "and I can show you the warrant." Eva went very still in the doorway. "I'm Eva Bristol," she said from across the room, because she was not going to let anyone discuss her from a distance. What warrant? The marshal turned. His name was Cade, he informed her, and he was out of Fort Worth, and he had a warrant for the arrest of one Eva Bristol, formerly employed by Gerald Rowe Merchant Trade of San Antonio, on charges of fraud and theft in the amount of $1,000. Eva felt a cold clarity settle over her. She had known Gerald would try something. She had known it with the part of her mind that had been dealing with dishonest men long enough to understand their patterns. She had simply not known he would find someone willing to file false charges in a different county. "Those charges are false," she said, in a tone that was so steady it seemed to make Cade uncertain. "The warrant says." "The warrant is wrong. I have documentation of Mr. Rowe's actual fraud which I filed with the county clerk in San Antonio's office 8 months ago. If you contact that office, they will confirm it." Cade looked at her. He looked at Arthur, who was frowning deeply. "The warrant is issued," Cade said. "I have to bring you in. You can make your case in Fort Worth." "Fort Worth," Eva said, "where Gerald Rowe has business connections." Something like discomfort crossed Cade's face, but he was a man with a piece of paper and a job to do, and he was not going to let discomfort stop him. She was in a profound difficulty. Fort Worth was 3 days away. Her documentation was in San Antonio, with the county clerk, which was 4 days in the other direction. If she was taken to Fort Worth, she would be dealing with a court in a city where Gerald Rowe had friends, without her documents, without a lawyer, and without the ability to run her own defense. She needed a lawyer and she needed her documents, and she had neither, and the situation was, for the first time since she had come to Dusthaven, genuinely beyond what she could manage alone. She thought about the promise she had made to herself. Then she thought more carefully about what the promise had actually been. She had promised never to rely on a man, not never to ask for help, not never to allow anyone into her life or her struggle. She had promised not to become dependent, not to hand herself over to someone else's management. And there was, she recognized with a clarity that surprised her with its force, a difference. There was a significant, important, real difference between becoming dependent on someone and making use of assistance when you needed it. Between handing your life to someone else to run and accepting specific help with a specific problem from someone you had chosen to trust. The promise had never been about isolation. She had made it in anger, in the aftermath of betrayal, and she had built it into a wall that protected her from everything, including things that were not what she was protecting herself from. She said, "I need to send a message to Benjamin Lockhart." Arthur was already moving toward the door. Benjamin was there within 40 minutes, which meant he had ridden Cinder at a pace that the horse was probably not entirely grateful for. He came through the mercantile door, assessed the situation in a single look, Eva standing straight, Cade with his warrant, Arthur worried in his chair, and came to stand beside Eva, not in front of her but beside her, exactly beside her, which she registered precisely. "What's the charge?" he asked Cade. "Fraud and theft," Cade said. "Out of San Antonio." "Filed by who?" "Gerald Rowe." Benjamin's jaw tightened. He had heard about Gerald Rowe. Eva had told him pieces of it over the past weeks, not the full story but enough. She filed her own report with the San Antonio County Clerk's office before she ever left that city, he said. "I'd suggest you wire that office before you take anyone anywhere." "I have a warrant." "You have a warrant filed by the man she reported," Benjamin said calmly. "That's worth examining before you make a very significant error." Cade looked between them. He was not a stupid man, he was a limited one, which is different, and being limited, he knew enough to be cautious when faced with the kind of steady certainty that both Benjamin and Eva were projecting. "I'll wire the San Antonio office," he said finally, "but she stays in town while I wait for a response." "She's going nowhere," Benjamin said, and then, catching Eva's expression, added, "because that is clearly her own choice." She almost laughed. In the middle of all of it, she almost laughed. The reply from the San Antonio County Clerk's office came in 2 days. It confirmed that Eva Bristol had filed a report against Gerald Rowe, that the investigation into Gerald Rowe's fraud was ongoing, and that Eva Bristol was a named witness and not a suspect. The warrant, it noted, appeared to have been filed using falsified documents. Cade left Dusthaven looking like a man who had made a mistake he would not be making again. Eva stood on the front step of the mercantile watching him ride out of town, and the enormity of the past 2 days settled over her all at once, not collapsing her, but landing, heavy and real. Benjamin was standing a few feet away. He had stayed. He had stayed through both days, not hovering, not pressing, just being present in the way that a solid thing is present, available and undemanding. She looked at him. He looked back at her. "You were right about Gerald Rowe," he said. "He is not creative." "He's not," she agreed. And then, because she needed to say it, "Thank you." "You would have managed it," he said. "I might have, but not as quickly. And without you, Cade might have taken me to Fort Worth before the wire could be answered." And then she stopped. "You don't have to account for it," he said. "I want to." She took a breath. "I have spent a great deal of energy building a life that does not require anyone. I believe I confused independence with isolation. I think," she paused, searching for the right precision. "I think the difference between dependence and partnership is something I had decided not to consider." He was very still, listening. "I don't know what I'm saying," she said, which was not true. She knew exactly what she was saying. "I think you do," he said, gently. She looked at him, at the steadiness in his dark eyes and the way he stood, unhurried, not filling the silence with anything she had not invited. And she thought about every Thursday morning for 4 months, every book passed between them, every conversation on the back steps, every moment he had offered something specific, and then left it exactly where she could reach it or not as she chose. "I think I might be in love with you," she said, which was not how she had imagined saying it, in any of the versions she had not been imagining. "And I find that," she searched, "significantly inconvenient." Something shifted in his face then, that contained warmth opening up, the smile that changed his whole expression, warmer than she had seen it. "It is inconvenient," he agreed. "I've been in love with you since you told Pete Morrison his overcharging wasn't creative." She stared at him. "That was the first week." "Yes." "You managed 4 months of Thursdays with a great deal of patience," he said, "and a good deal of assistance from George Eliot." She laughed. A full, real laugh, and she felt it break something open in her chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He took 1 step toward her slowly, giving her all the time in the world to stop it or step back, and she did not step back. And when he reached out and took her hand with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, she felt the warmth of it go straight through the cold armor she had been wearing for years. "I will never ask you to be less than you are," he said, very quietly. "I don't want someone to run my household or run my ranch or run my life. I want someone to run things alongside me and argue with me about books and tell me when I'm wrong, which will be regularly." "It will be," she confirmed. He raised her hand to his lips very briefly, and the gesture was so old-fashioned and so sincere that she felt tears threaten, which was extraordinary because she did not cry in front of anyone. "Will you come to supper Sunday?" he asked. "At the ranch. I'd like you to see it." "Yes," she said, and then, "You'll need to show me the accounts." "I was counting on it," he said. The ranch was 12 miles of open country from Dusthaven, and Eva rode out on Sunday morning on a steady chestnut mare she had borrowed from the livery stable, through landscape that was achingly beautiful in the early light, flat red earth studded with mesquite and cedar. The sky enormous overhead in shades of orange and gold that shifted to pale blue as the sun climbed. She had lived in cities most of her adult life, and she had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully allowed herself to know, that land like this could do something to the inside of your chest. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, not grand, but solid, built from wood and local stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and mature oak trees that had probably been there before any of this was ranch country at all. There were outbuildings, a large stable, and corrals where several horses moved in the early heat. Benjamin met her at the gate on horseback, having apparently been out since before sunup. He looked at ease out here in a way that was different from the way he looked in town, still the same, but more fully himself, the way a person is when they are in their rightful environment. The 6 ranch hands were introduced without ceremony, and she liked them for the same reason she was learning to like most things here. They simply were what they were. She met an older man named Walt who had been there since Benjamin's father's time, and a younger one named Louis whose family was from Chihuahua and who spoke to Eva in Spanish when he realized she spoke it, which she had learned from the women who had worked in the San Antonio household where she had first been employed, and which delighted him considerably. The ranch accounts were kept in a straightforward system that was functional, but had some inefficiencies she could see immediately. She told him so over the supper that his housekeeper, a woman named Agnes, had made roast chicken and cornbread and green beans from someone's kitchen garden. "You looked at them for 10 minutes, he said. "I'm a fast reader. Do they concern you?" "Not deeply. You're managing fine, but you're losing about 3% per year in supply pricing that better negotiation would recover." He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was warm, and Agnes had gone home, and the house was quiet around them with that particular depth of quiet that the open land produced. 3% per year over the past 10 years, he said, doing the arithmetic. "I know," she said. "We don't have to talk about it tonight." "I want to talk about it tonight," he said. "I want to talk about everything." They sat at that table for 3 hours, talking, not only about accounts but about the ranch's future, about the cattle market and the coming expansion of the railroad, about what Dusthaven might become and what the Texas frontier was becoming around them, about Eva's idea that the mercantile could expand into a proper supply hub for the surrounding ranches if Arthur could be persuaded to take on a partner. They talked about the war, which he had fought in and which had shaped him. They talked about Nashville, which she had left and which had shaped her. They talked about her father, the way he had left her mother with nothing, not maliciously, just with the complete assumption that nothing was required, that a man's death should not require his wife to have any independent means. He was a product of his time, Benjamin said, carefully. "Most horrors are," Eva replied. "That doesn't make them less horrible." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She rode back to Dusthaven in the dark, under a sky so full of stars that it felt generous, and she thought that she had been right about the difference between isolation and independence, and that understanding the difference was perhaps the most important thing she had learned in Dusthaven, more important than the quarterly accounts or the supply negotiations, or even what George Eliot had to say about Dorothea Brooke. The weeks that followed were the kind that build a life between them without announcing themselves. August burned its way toward September. Arthur Finch recovered more fully than Dr. Alcott had predicted, which Dr. Alcott attributed to the fact that he no longer had anything to worry about, all of it having been thoroughly taken over by Eva. Benjamin came to Dusthaven on Thursdays and also on Sundays after the first Sunday, and sometimes in between on errand or pretext, and Eva stopped keeping count of the times he came, and simply noted that when he arrived the day acquired a different quality that she was willing to call better. She also went to the ranch. She went often enough that Louis stopped formally greeting her, and simply waved from wherever he was working, which she took as a mark of genuine acceptance. She helped Agnes with the kitchen garden one afternoon, which she had never done before and found she enjoyed in a way that connected her to something root deep in the soil. She told Benjamin about Gerald Rowe fully, the complete story, without the careful editing she had been using. She told him about the 3 years of employment, the growing trust, the slow realization that the accounts were not what they had been, the sick certainty when she understood what Gerald had done and what he was planning to do with her in the middle of it. Benjamin listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "I'm sorry he did that to you. Not you were brave or you handled it well, just the direct acknowledgement that a wrong had been done and he was sorry for it." She found that it helped in a way that praise would not have. He's going to face charges, she said. The San Antonio investigation is moving forward. I'll likely need to provide testimony. I'll go with you if you want company, he said, or I won't if you'd rather do it alone. I'd like company, she said, and it did not cost her what she would have expected it to cost her. September arrived, and with it the start of the cattle drive, Benjamin's annual drive to the railhead at Abilene, which took his ranch hands and 3 weeks of hard riding across the Texas plains. Eva had known it was coming, but had not fully appreciated what it would feel like to watch him ride out of Dusthaven at dawn with 6 men and 400 cattle, heading north into country that the summer heat had bleached to gold. She stood on the main street and watched the dust of the herd settle over the horizon, and she felt the absence the way you feel a missing tooth, the specific familiar space where something solid had been. She was annoyed with herself for feeling it. Then she thought about what she had realized about the difference between dependence and love, and she decided that missing someone was not the same as depending on them. It was simply knowing their value. She ran the mercantile, and she taught the Tor's children, and she visited Arthur in the evenings, and she wrote a letter to Benjamin that she did not send because she was not sure what to put in it that she had not already said in person. And then she wrote another one that she did send, which was mostly about a dispute she was having with the new supply wagon driver and what she thought about the state of Dusthaven's future prosperity, and which contained exactly one sentence at the end that said, "I find the Thursdays without a supply order to manage are significantly less interesting." He was gone for 3 weeks. He came back on a Tuesday, which was unexpected, and she heard Cinder's hooves on the main street from inside the mercantile, and she was out the front door before she had consciously decided to be there. He looked tired in the way that 3 weeks of cattle drive made a person look, weathered and lean, with trail dust on his coat and a shadow of a beard he had not had when he left. He swung down from the saddle and looked at her and smiled. "You sent me a letter," he said. "I sent you a letter about supply chain logistics," she said, "and one other thing, a minor observation." "I wrote back," he said, and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I didn't mail it because I was already coming back." She took the paper. She read it standing in the street, which was perhaps not the most composed thing she had ever done, but composure was not the point. The letter was about the cattle drive and the price he had gotten at the railhead better than last year, and about the country between here and Abilene and a particular thunderstorm that had come through on the 2nd week. And at the end, one sentence that said, "I think about you the way a man thinks about home when he is somewhere that is not it." She folded the paper. She looked at him. He was still watching her with the steady patience that she had come to understand was simply who he was, a man who waited not because he was passive, but because he respected the pace of things. She stepped forward and kissed him, which she had been thinking about for approximately 3 months in the careful way that she thought about things she was not ready to think about directly. And it was, she found, exactly as right as she had suspected and more. He kissed her back with the same thoroughness he brought to everything worth doing, and when they separated, she was aware that they were standing in the middle of Dusthaven's main street and that Mrs. Calloway was watching from the doorway of the millinery shop with a satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for this to happen for some time. "Well," said Arthur Finch, appearing at the mercantile door behind her, in the same tone he had used the very first time Benjamin Lockhart had come into the back room. "Not a word," Eva said to Arthur. "I wasn't going to say anything," Arthur said very smugly. October came in cooler and golden, and with it, a series of conversations that moved naturally from what they had built together toward what they might build further. They were not impetuous. Neither of them was impetuous, which was one of the things they shared, and they arrived at decisions the way they arrived at everything, through reasoning and honesty and the particular confidence of 2 people who had talked enough to know each other with some depth. Benjamin asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in late October, sitting on the ranch house porch with the sun going down behind the hills and the air smelling of cedar, and the faint, pleasant smoke of Agnes's kitchen. He did not make it theatrical. He had the ring, a small, perfectly simple gold band with a single dark garnet, and he held it out with both hands, which struck her as exactly right, both hands, nothing held back, nothing performed. "I want to be your husband," he said, "and I want you to keep being exactly who you are, including all the parts that argue with my account management and negotiate better deals with supply drivers and make Pete Morrison look incompetent. Especially those parts." "I would have kept being exactly who I am regardless," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not a condition, it's an aspiration. I want to be with you as you are, not as I'd redesign you." She looked at the ring and then at him. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she turned her hand in the last of the sunset light to see the garnet catch it like a small dark fire. They were married in December, in Dusthaven's leaning little church, which had been straightened somewhat by the combined effort of Benjamin and Tor's the blacksmith over the course of 2 November weekends, which Eva took as a metaphor she did not over-examine. The ceremony was performed by the pastor, a young man named Cooper who had arrived from the East only that year and still looked mildly astounded by the frontier on a daily basis. Arthur Finch stood for her, because she had no family who could make the trip, and Walt, the elder ranch hand, stood for Benjamin. Mrs. Calloway wept. The Tor's children sat in the front pew and managed to stay seated for a full 20 minutes, which was a record. Lewis had made something with Chihuahuan spices for the celebration afterward that made the entire gathering considerably more festive than anticipated. The Nguyen family came, bringing winter vegetables and warm wishes, and Eva was glad to see them there because they belonged there, in this community that was imperfect and complicated and real. She moved to the ranch. She was not leaving Dusthaven. She came in 3 days a week to continue working with Arthur, who had proposed a formal partnership arrangement that suited everyone. She was becoming something that she had not had a complete word for before: rooted. She kept her own ledger, her own accounts, her own correspondence. She negotiated directly with suppliers for both the mercantile and the ranch, which produced savings that impressed even Walt, who was not easily impressed. She continued teaching the Tor's children and 3 others besides, which evolved slowly and without formal announcement into a small school that met in the mercantile's back room twice a week, which was perhaps not a permanent solution, but was considerably better than nothing. She wrote to the San Antonio County Clerk's office in January and received word that Gerald Rowe had pleaded guilty to 1 count of fraud and was facing significant fines and likely imprisonment. She did not feel triumphant. She felt finished, the way a door you have been holding shut can finally be set properly in its frame and latched. She told Benjamin over supper. He raised his coffee cup. "To the county clerk's office," he said. "To the evidence I gathered," she corrected. "To the evidence you gathered," he agreed. By February she had been at the ranch long enough to understand its rhythms and to see, with fresh eyes, where those rhythms could be improved. The winter was milder than most, the cattle managed well, the hay stores held, and Benjamin's careful management of the previous autumn's income meant they went into spring in a strong position. Eva had added a garden to the east side of the house with Agnes's guidance, and in the cold months she planned it like a campaign, with sketches and seed catalogs and lists that made Benjamin laugh with their thoroughness. "It's 8 by 10 feet of garden," he said. "It's a system," she said. "Of course it is." Spring came back to Dusthaven the way it always did, quietly at first, then with the sudden exuberant green of the cottonwoods, the thin wildflowers appearing along the creek, the mornings becoming something you could stand in without bracing. Eva rode into town on a Wednesday morning in early March to work at the mercantile, and found herself stopping at the edge of the main street just to look at it. The leaning church that no longer leaned, the mercantile with its properly hung bell, the Tor's shop with its smell of metal and the blacksmith's fire, the Nguyen family's cart parked outside with the early spring vegetables. A year ago she had stepped off a stage with a carpetbag and a promise she had made in anger that had protected her from everything, including the things worth having. She had kept the important part of that promise and let the rest of it go. She had not lost herself in love. She had not become smaller or quieter or more accommodating. She had become something she had not exactly known how to want, not independent of everything, but independent within something, which was a different architecture entirely. She was still Eva Bristol. She had taken no one's name, and Benjamin had not pressed for it. He had said, with characteristic practicality, that her name was her name, and he had married the person, not the legal formality, and that however she preferred to handle it was her affair. She had considered it for 2 weeks and decided to call herself Eva Bristol Lockhart in the records because she wanted to, not because she was required to, which was the only basis on which she intended to make decisions for the rest of her life. In April, she told Benjamin she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, over breakfast, without ceremony, because she was not a ceremonial person, and she watched his face travel through something she had never seen it do before. Not the contained warmth she was accustomed to, but something more unguarded, more wide open, as if for a moment all the careful steadiness had stepped aside to let through something enormous. He put down his coffee cup. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands gently, always so careful, and he looked at her for a long moment before he kissed her, and the kiss was everything she had come to understand about him, steady and sure and entirely present. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Excellent," she said, "and slightly like the world has shifted on its axis." "I think it has," he said. She continued working through the spring and into summer, adjusting the pace as needed but not stopping, because stopping was not her disposition and her health gave her no reason to. Dr. Alcott monitored her with the benevolent severity of a man who knew better than to tell Eva Bristol what she should or should not be doing, and settled for making sure she was doing it safely. Agnes took on additional kitchen duties with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a reason to be more involved. The summer of 1879 was notable in Dusthaven for several things. A new telegraph office that connected the town to the wider world with something approaching real speed, the formalization of Eva's school into an official arrangement with the county, which provided a small budget and the promise of a proper schoolroom by the following year, and the birth, in August, of a boy. They named him James Arthur Lockhart James for no specific reason, except that it was a name they both liked the sound of, and Arthur because Arthur Finch wept at the suggestion with such complete lack of embarrassment that there was no other reasonable choice. James Arthur Lockhart arrived on a warm August morning, as inconveniently and dramatically as one would expect of the child of Eva Bristol and Benjamin Lockhart, and he was announced to the world with a voice that made Agnes say, from outside the bedroom door, that the child clearly had opinions. "He comes by it honestly," Benjamin said, sitting beside Eva in the careful way of a man who has just witnessed something tremendous and is still orienting himself to the new landscape. Eva held their son, who had dark eyes that might resolve into any color and a grip that was already determined, and she felt something she had no word for except complete. Not because the child completed her, she had been complete before and knew it, but because she was full of things now, full of the life she had made, and the wholeness of it was its own extraordinary thing. "He's going to be difficult," she said. "Undoubtedly," Benjamin agreed. "Good," she said. The telegraph office brought news that Gerald Rowe had been sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment in San Antonio, which Eva received with the equanimity of someone who had already closed that chapter and was several chapters past it. She wrote to the county about the schoolroom in September, while James was 6 weeks old and sleeping in a basket beside her desk, with the cooperative spirit of a child who understood that work was happening. And she made the argument so thoroughly that the county approved a budget within a month, which shocked everyone except Eva. Arthur Finch, formerly now her business partner, told her at their October partnership meeting that the mercantile had had its best year on record. He said it with the pride of someone who knows he is not the primary cause. "We had its best year," Eva said, dividing the credit because it was accurate. "You had its best year," he said. "I mostly sat in my chair and was grateful." She let him have the last word on that because she was a fair person. November brought Benjamin's second cattle drive south. Not Abilene this time, but a buyer who had come to them, which was a distinction Eva appreciated as evidence of the ranch's growing reputation. He was gone 2 weeks. She managed the ranch, the mercantile, the school, and James Arthur with the organized determination that she brought to all multivariable systems. And when Benjamin came back, she was at the porch railing with James on her hip and the very faintest suggestion of satisfaction in her expression that she could not quite suppress. "You managed everything," he said, swinging down from Cinder. "Of course I did." He walked up the porch steps and kissed her, and then kissed the top of James's head. And the baby regarded him with the focused suspicion of a person meeting someone new, and then apparently decided he was acceptable and grabbed hold of his father's collar. "Hello," Benjamin said to his son, with a gravity that made Eva's chest do something warm. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold but manageable, and the ranch house, which had been warm enough for 1 person and adequate for 2, became properly inhabited by 3 and felt different in the way a place does when it is genuinely used as a home. James grew with the alarming speed that small humans deploy, and by spring he was sitting up with fierce determination and attempting to apply that determination to forward motion with mixed results. Eva's school opened formally in March of 1880 in a proper building, small but properly built, with a real floor and real windows, and 8 students aged 6 to 13, which included 3 of the tour's children, the Nguyen family's youngest daughter, 2 children of ranch families from outside town, and the barber's son, who was a quick learner and would have been quicker if he could be persuaded to pay attention. She stood in the doorway of the schoolroom on the first official morning and looked at the desks. She had ordered them from the catalog, 8 of them, and they had arrived only 3 days before and still smelled of fresh wood. And she felt a particular satisfaction that was different from all other kinds. She had built this. Not alone, the county had funded it, and parents had helped carry the desks, and Benjamin had installed the blackboard himself one Saturday with Lewis's assistance and considerable commentary. But it had come from her idea and her argument and her persistence, and it served something real. In the summer of 1880, Eva discovered she was expecting a second child, and this time she told Benjamin over breakfast again because she was consistent, and this time she added without being asked, "I would like another boy, or a girl. I am genuinely indifferent, but I want you to know I won't have strong feelings either way if that reassures you." "I had no feelings about it either way," he said. "I just want them healthy." "Agreed," she said. Their second child, born in February of 1881 on a cold morning that arrived with ice on the windows, and a fire going so high in the bedroom fireplace that Agnes said the room was warm enough for livestock, was a girl. They named her Clara May Lockhart Clara for the clear quality of the winter morning she had come into, and May because Eva had always quietly loved the name and had never told anyone, and it seemed like the right moment to stop keeping that particular secret. Clara arrived with considerably less drama than James had, as if she had observed her brother's arrival and decided efficiency was preferable, and she opened her eyes immediately in a way that made Dr. Alcott say he had never seen a newborn look so purposeful. "She gets that from her mother," Benjamin said, from beside Eva, and Eva thought that was the finest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she was going to carry it for the rest of her life. By the spring of 1881, Dusthaven had grown. The telegraph office had brought connections that brought business that brought people, and the population that had been 300 when Eva arrived was approaching 500. The mercantile had expanded a proper second room, better storage, a new loading dock that Pete Morrison was no longer allowed within 50 feet of for the management of supply deliveries. The school had 8 students regularly and occasionally more, and Eva had hired a part-time teacher's aide, a young woman named Rosa who had come from one of the ranch families south of town, and who had a gift for mathematics that Eva intended to develop aggressively. The Nguyen family had expanded their plot and were supplying vegetables not just to Dusthaven, but to 2 neighboring towns, and Eva had helped them establish the supply arrangements with the same matter-of-fact competence she applied to everything, because it was the right thing to help with, and also because the spring onions were extraordinary. The situation of the Chinese families in the territory was not uniformly better. There were still towns that were worse, and Eva was not naive about the persistence of the ugliness. But in Dusthaven, at least, the community that had formed was one that included the people who had come from all over, and she credited some of that to the example Benjamin had set before she arrived, and the standard they maintained together now. James, who was almost 2, had developed a walking gait that was pure confidence in motion, and a vocabulary of approximately 12 words that he deployed, with the selectivity of someone who had opinions about when speech was warranted. He was fascinated by horses in the way of children who grow up around them, not afraid, just intensely respectful, which was appropriate. Clara, who was 4 months old and already making her preferences about things known through the particular clarity of a child who has not yet learned to moderate expression, watched her brother operate with what could generously be described as patient assessment. Eva sat on the ranch porch on a May evening in 1881, 3 years after she had stepped off the stage in Dusthaven with a carpetbag and a promise she had made in anger, and she thought about the distance between who she had been and who she was now. She was not softer. She was not smaller. She was not less. She had more and more depth to the more, and more understanding of what had always been possible if she had been willing to trust the right distinctions. Benjamin sat beside her, with James on his knee pointing at things on the horizon and providing commentary in his 12-word vocabulary, and Clara in the carry cloth against Eva's chest, asleep with the complete commitment to sleep that only babies command. The sky was the particular reddish gold of Texas evenings, the kind that photographers were beginning to come out west to try to capture and never quite managed, because a photograph could not hold the air and the size of it. "Tell me something you're thinking about," Benjamin said, which was what he said when he could tell she was working through something and wanted to be in the conversation if she was ready for company. "I was thinking about the promise I made myself," she said, "in San Antonio." He did not ask which promise, he knew. "I almost kept it perfectly," she said, "in the worst possible way." "The bell bracket," he said. She looked at him. "You remember that?" "Of course I remember that." "You were on a chair with the wrong screwdriver looking at me with an expression that said you would fix that bell single-handedly through sheer force of will if necessary." "I would have. I know. That's why I offered the right tool and not an opinion about the wrong tool." She thought about that moment, which had seemed small and turned out to be the first time she had understood something important about him, that he gave what was needed and did not add anything that had not been asked for, that the help he offered was help for the problem, not for her, and the difference was everything. "You showed me something," she said. "I had promised myself never to rely on a man, and you showed me the difference between relying on someone and choosing them." He was quiet for a moment. James had stopped pointing at the horizon and was now focusing on Cinder, who was in the corral visible from the porch and probably wondering why he was being stared at by a toddler. "I think you showed yourself," Benjamin said. "I just tried not to get in the way of it." "That is the most understated possible version of what happened," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You are a thoroughly impractical man dressed as a practical one," she said, "and I have now had 3 years of evidence to support this position." He laughed, which was a sound she had collected carefully from the first time she had heard it, Not the polite laugh he used with people he was being pleasant with, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine. She had that laugh. It was one of the things she had that she had not expected to want and now could not imagine without. James, apparently feeling left out of the conversation, said one of his 12 words. "No." "He's right," Eva said. "About what?" "Everything, probably." "He usually is." The evening settled around them, warm and full, with the cattle sounds from the far field and the spring insects beginning in the grasses, and the smell of Agnes's supper coming through the kitchen window. Clara stirred briefly against Eva's chest, made a sound that indicated she had opinions about being disturbed, and settled back into sleep. Eva thought about everything that she had built, and everything she had been given, and everything she had chosen. And she thought that the most important thing she had understood in the past 3 years was that independence was not the absence of connection. It was the ability to choose connection freely, from a position of wholeness, rather than having it forced or bargained or coerced. It was knowing that you could stand alone and choosing, with full clarity, to stand with someone. She had promised herself she would never rely on a man. And Benjamin Lockhart had shown her, with extraordinary patience and a wrong-sized screwdriver, and 60 pounds of inferior coffee blend and Mary Wollstonecraft's underlines, and a letter about home written on a cattle drive, that she had been keeping the wrong promise. The right one looked like this: a May evening on a ranch in Texas, with her children and her husband and her work and her name and everything she had chosen, nothing she had surrendered, everything she had wanted without knowing how to want it. The cottonwood trees along the creek were loud with the spring insects. The sky was turning from gold to rose to the first faint violet that came before dark. Cinder was still in the corral, probably still being assessed by James, who had now climbed down from his father's knee and was making the purposeful walk of a toddler toward the fence. Benjamin caught him at the second step, with the reflexive ease of a man whose body had learned to track a moving small person, and put him back on the porch with the firm gentleness of someone who understood the difference between stopping someone and controlling them. "No," James said again. "He gets that from you," Benjamin said. "He gets everything from me," Eva said. And she said it the way she said everything worth saying, with complete confidence and the particular warmth of a woman who knew exactly who she was and was, at long last, entirely glad of it. Dusthaven grew and changed and was shaped by the people who lived in it, as every place is shaped by its people, and in the years that followed the name of Eva Bristol Lockhart would be attached to the school that grew from 8 students to 30, to the partnership with Arthur Finch that grew from a single mercantile to a supply arrangement that served a dozen surrounding settlements, to the successful argument for a proper postal route through the territory, and to a certain reputation for asking inconvenient questions at town meetings that the council members privately dreaded and publicly appreciated. And Benjamin Lockhart's name was attached to his ranch, and his cattle and the letter he had written in support of the Nguyen family's land claim, and to a marriage that people in Dusthaven pointed to, in the way they pointed to the straightened church and the properly functioning bell above the mercantile door, as evidence of what it was possible to build when the right people found each other. Their third child, another boy, born in 1883, who they named Thomas and who arrived with the same purposeful energy as his sister and twice the volume, completed the household in a way that felt less like an ending than like the last piece of a structure that had been planned from the foundation up, solid and true, and built to last. Eva Bristol had come to Dusthaven with a carpetbag and a vow, and she had kept the best part of the vow and let go of the part that was only fear wearing the clothes of principle. And she had built something she could stand in the middle of and look around at and know, with the complete certainty of a woman who did not settle for anything less than precise accuracy, that it was exactly right. She had promised herself she would never rely on a man, and she never had. She had simply, with her eyes open and her own name on all the documents, chosen one.